Good afternoon, folks, or good morning, depending where you are. We're going to be starting our broadcast or our webinar here in just a few minutes. We have some more people still coming in, so we'll let them come in and get themselves ready to go, and we'll start off in just a few minutes, a few seconds, rather. Okay, well, let's get started on today's webinar. I'm Leo Raymond from Mailers Hub, and today we're going to be going over the horizon, looking over the horizon about the recently filed price change and beyond that, to see what's happening or not happening for the remainder of the calendar year here. So today we're going to cover a little bit about the rate case and some of the basics behind it, as well as we said, the PRC's actions, what they need to be doing or could be doing, and what's beyond that. So first of all, just as a level set, for those of you who may not be familiar with postal finances, with how rate cases operate, we're going to go over a few things here. The first one shows you the Postal Service's financial situation through August, which is the last month for which they published information. Their fiscal year ended at the end of September, and usually the end of year reports, fourth quarter reports, September monthly figures won't be out until probably early next month, so we're a ways away yet. But just the same, looking at August gives you an idea how the year is going, the year went. Their revenue was below plan, a little bit higher than the year before, of course, because there was a rate increase. Expenses, however, have been the big problem all along, and most of that is coming from externally imposed factors, the pre-funding obligation, and the workers' compensation adjustment. Just to give you an idea how that goes, from 1 month to the next, the swing in the obligation for workers' comp liability can go a billion with a B dollars. And although they're not paying any money for that, it's still a figure that goes against the books and contributes to this large red number you see right there, where they're well over twice what last year's loss was at the end of August. Volume, of course, through the end of August was not good. It was under plan, and it was well below last year. First class is leading the way, of course. As you know, we don't use first class mail to send out our bills, our payments anymore. We don't send cards and letters anymore. So that's driving the decline in retail first class. Commercial first class, the bills that are sent to us, that part of first class is relatively holding its own, but it's in a much slower decline. Marketing mail, of course, is very seasonally variable. It's variable on different events. We're going into a busier season now, but that wasn't apparent in August. If there's an election, standard mail has a great month, and it did that a year ago, but of course that wore off. Periodicals continuing to suffer as people begin to read their newspapers and magazines online rather than in paper. Shipping and package services had been growing by double digits, but as you can see right there, it's actually barely above zero for the year, and actually lost a month over month in the summer, because what you're seeing now is increasing diversion of the shipments that are involved in this class of mail to the senders or to the other carriers. Amazon, for example, is now insourcing a lot of its delivery because it has enough density to make it worth investing in its own network. UPS, for example, now has enough density of packages in some routes to begin taking back what it was formerly giving to the Postal Service for last mile delivery. So this is the picture through August of how the Postal Service's finances go. And this slide gives you an idea of where they are compared to their plan. They're below their plan on revenue. They're ahead of their plan, which is not good on expenses, and as we saw earlier, their loss for the year is well past what it should be, or what they would have wanted to be too. Volume, again, down below where it was expected to be, and shipping and package services not doing as well as they'd hoped either. So that's in which this rate case was filed. Now, if you don't understand how the price change system works, or the rate case system works, 13 years ago, Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. We call it Postal Reform. And it replaced the 36-year-old cost of service rate-making process, which was actually litigation. The Postal Service would file a case with the Postal Regulatory Commission, or the Postal Rate Commission, as it was called then, and then it would have to defend its filing against representatives of the different classes of mail, for example. So you would have lawyers representing first class or standard mail, or what do they call first and third back then, arguing about how their class should not be getting a big hit and somebody else should. So that was all done away with in the 2006 change, which also split Postal Service's classes of mail or types of mail into two big buckets: market dominant and competitive. And it said how long the Postal Service had to give its customers notice when those prices are going to change. So most of the conversation around a price change involves market dominant products: first class, marketing mail, standard mail, periodicals, what's left of package services, and special services, ancillary services, and so forth. And that all, of course, works around the CPI cap, which was established by the Postal Reform Law. And then the price change proposals that are presented by the Postal Service, such as the one we saw last week, have to be approved by the Postal Regulatory Commission. Now, the other bucket, competitive products, that's express mail, priority mail, first-class package service, all the ground parcel services, and ancillary services that are competitive in nature. So even those were split into two. Those prices, though, for all those types of mail are not capped, but they are in a sense managed or regulated, if you will, by the marketplace. So the governors of the Postal Service, now this is the appointed people, not the PMG and the deputy, but the appointed governors are who decide on the prices to be set for competitive products. They also approve the filing of the rate case for market dominant products, but the governors actually set the prices for competitive products. The PRC's role then is to look at those prices for competitive products and make sure they meet statutory requirements, and we'll go over those later on in the presentation. So that's what we've got right now. We have a case filed under the relatively new postal reform system for market dominant products. Now, the cap I mentioned to you, the CPI cap. The CPI cap is working with a percentage derived from a rolling 12-month average of the cost of living index that is issued by the Department of Labor. Now, because the Postal Service wants to be on an annual cycle, they will use the August CPI as the basis for their rate change, their rate case proposal. For whatever it's worth, the CPI came out this week for September, and the number went down. The calculated 12-month average went down. So they probably saved themselves or got themselves a little more income by filing in August on a regular annualized basis. The top line shows you the movement of that calculated cap. And as you can see, from the last time it was filed in 2018 until it was just recently filed, the cap actually got smaller, over half a percentage point year over year, because as the bottom chart shows, the increase in the CPI was negative for many, many months. Now, that may seem like a good thing for ratepayers, but not a good thing for the Postal Service because, as we saw earlier, its bills continue. So it has to pay its bills, and it becomes harder and harder if their source of revenue, their only source of revenue, it keeps shrinking. So that's the CPI cap. That's where it came from, and it's 1.9 for the price change filed last week. Okay, so this is how it looks. The cap establishes the Postal Service's rate authority, its authority to increase prices, and it's applied at the class level. And in this case, special services is called a class. Now, if they don't use it all for some reason, that authority can be banked. So what you can see in that top chart there is they had a little bit left over from the last rate case, which was in 2018, a year ago, and they had that available to them to use this year. They can use it all or not. So what they did this year was use some of it, most of it, and then banked what was left over for the next time. And the bottom chart shows you how much is left over. Because periodicals are so badly underwater, they never leave any money on the table for that. But the others, they chose to mitigate the increase a little bit, and that's why they have some authority left over for the next time, for 2020. So here are the price changes in general. It was filed on the 9th. The average increase is 1.9. But working with the banked amounts, you can see how that was actually a little bit different than 1.9. And of course, within any class of mail, as you've seen if you looked at the price charts already and the percentage changes that those price changes represent, individual price categories and cells can be wildly different than the 1.9% that is at the class level. And that's possible because everything is based upon a volume-weighted average. So if you've got a class of mail where a lot of volume is represented by a couple of rate cells, a change there can have a lot more of an influence on compliance with the 1.9% increase than a change in some smaller volume category. And we'll show some examples here as we go along. Now, in any case, the rates that are proposed have to cover costs. And one of the things that the PRC does is it looks at whether or not the proposed rate does that. And if it doesn't cover costs, there needs to be a justification of some sort by the Postal Service, or the PRC can kick it back and tell the Postal Service to fix that. And the same holds true for work sharing. Work sharing, of course, is what the mail preparer does to save the Postal Service cost and effort and work. And the value of that work saved is translated back in what's called a pass-through in the rates back to the ratepayer. Well, if the Postal Service overcompensates you for that, then they're giving you a pass-through above 100%. And the Postal Regulatory Commission has been very diligent in the past couple of years in telling the Postal Service to knock that off, to start passing through closer to 100% than in some cases 150%. So you'll see some changes in this case, as you saw in the last case, that reflect that directive. Now, given the timing of all of this, we expect to get a decision by mid-November about the rates that are planned for market-dominant products with implementation at the end of January. When I sent out the newsletter in the wee small hours Sunday night or Monday morning, I had proofread it, but the most obvious thing any proofreader misses is always, what proofreaders miss is the most obvious thing. So I said the new rates are going to take effect in January of 2019. Well, we all know that's not the case. Anyways, looking at first class, the class average there is a little bit more than 1.9 because they use some of their banked authority. But the single piece rates hardly changed at all. In fact, the single piece rates for letters, for stamped letters, metered mail, and so forth did not change. There's a slight decrease in qualified BRM, QBRM. So that accounts for the 0.002 minus. You had an increase at about the CPI for pre-sort letters, pre-sort cards, but the real hit was on flats. Ironically, a year ago, flats got a bit of a reduction, but this time they certainly took it in the neck. And we'll take a little more detailed look at that in a slide or two. So the retail price is unchanged, as I said. Flat prices really took a jump to improve their cost coverage. And there were some increases that happened this year that didn't happen last year. The theme throughout this is the Postal Service's perspective that a rate case should not be seen in isolation, but should be seen as part of a multi-year cycle at which things average out over time. So in this case, you'll see some rates being sharply raised, when in fact they were not affected hardly last year at all, and vice versa. So this is part of the Postal Service's deliberate approach, what they would call as a pricing strategy, where you shouldn't look at a rate case by itself, but as part of a stream of rate cases. Now, this next slide shows you how first-class mail, single-piece rates literally didn't change. And we talked about QBRM as being the only thing where there was a little bit of a difference. But then again, last year, again, looking at this as a multi-year process, they took a big jump last year. Last year, the stamps went to 55 cents, which was a considerable jump over the prior price. And this, of course, became an issue for a lawyer from San Francisco called Doug Carlson, who thought that the Postal Regulatory Commission did not adequately demand justification from the Postal Service for the jump to 55 cents. And what happened was several weeks ago, the appeals court in D.C. actually agreed with him and told the PRC they had failed to properly justify allowing this increase to go forward. So this was, at the present time, that's hanging out there. And the Postal Service said, look, the court's mandate to rewind this price or review it hasn't been issued formally as yet. So there could be appeals of the ruling yet to come. But what they're saying is the most appropriate thing is to look at that in this case and figure out how to solve the whole thing all at once. So that's their approach. That's their suggestion. Obviously, if you undid the 2018 filing, which took effect this past January, I don't know how you're going to go about refunding or resetting the rates back to what they were and then deal with a price increase, in this case, in some logical fashion. So we'll see how this works out over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks. Okay, the next thing is flats. Now, looking at the prices for flats, and this is again retail, and for keys, and I don't know how many people still send keys and those things back in the mail, but the price for them is getting really expensive. So those have been sharply increased, ironically, after some significant decreases last year. So you can see the jump, for example, for a 13-ounce flat goes from $280 up to $340 retail, which is a 21.5% increase. So they're catching up a lot of prices here compared to where they were last year, most of which are being raised because they have a problem with cost coverage. Again, talking about the basics of rate cases, you have to cover the cost of the pieces in that rate cell, in that rate category. So these are the pre-sorted, the percentage changes for pre-sorted mail. These went above CPI, but again, because we're looking at things in a multi-year process, these increases over the 2 years, last year and this year, end up a little bit more in line with how the CPI cap would have changed. So this is how the Postal Service wants to show its multi-year perspective in looking at rate changes over the course of 2 or 3 years. Again, we're seeing flats prices, the lighter weight flats actually getting a decrease compared to the current prices, but the heavier weight flats really taking a jump, so that your non-automation flat at the 13-ounce level goes from just under $260 to $321, a significant increase because it costs more to handle those pieces, and it's necessary to make sure the price for them covers the cost of processing them. Now, comparing the changes from last year to the changes this year, you can see that last year pre-sort 5-digit, for example, went up a little about 1.3. Others went up less than 1%. Non-machinable went down. This year, you can see that's a different picture. But if you add the two together, last year the cap was 2.419. So you figure 2.4 and 1.9 is what? Almost 4 points, like 4.3. If you add what you can see here together, you end up just about where that's supposed to be. So last year the flats prices were significantly reduced. This year the tide came back in and they were significantly increased. So if you want to take the time to take all these rate cells and add them all together and see how the change over the 2-year span was, then you'd have a better idea about how things have grown over the 2-year period compared to what the cap would allow. Now, marketing mail. Same idea here. You've got a class average of just under 1.9%, but letters are seeing a little bit higher change as a group. Flats and parcels, a significantly higher change as a group, but saturation and high density items are getting a lower, and carrier out, getting a lower than capped level of increase. Now, again, think about how all these things are moving over the course of a longer period of time, and it might make a little bit more sense. Again, the other consideration is a logical relationship in prices. If you've got destination entry discounts, for example, applying a percentage increase across the board may make a result that is illogical or that does not align with the Postal Service's intentions for price signals. They use price as a way to encourage behavior. Giving a big discount or a smaller discount tells the mailer what he or she should be doing with that type of mail. You should be pre-sorting more. You should be destination entering or whatever. Then sometimes the relationships between rates need to be tweaked a little bit to make sure that they make sense. So that's why you'll see an inconsistent increase from one rate cell to the next in the work sharing categories, because that's one of the things that has to be maintained is a reasonable relationship between different cells. Again, cost coverage is an issue. Cost coverage is always an issue, and nonprofit rates by law have to be set at about 60% of the commercial rates. So that's why you see a certain relationship being maintained there. And also because of the calculations that occur, you have some rate relationship issues that have to be dealt with in those prices. So those are the things that are going on behind the scenes. So let's look at some of the under CPI changes and over CPI changes. And we talked about how the Postal Service is being pressured to align its work sharing discounts, the pass-through. And you can see in the circles there, the red circles, that for some categories of non-automation mail, you're seeing a significantly over CPI increase, not because necessarily of a change in cost coverage, but because the Postal Service has to reduce how much they allow you for your discount. Again, if the work-share discount is too much beyond the value of the work that's actually avoided, the PRC insists that the Postal Service alter the discount and bring it back down closer to 100%. And every year in the filing, you can see how the Postal Service reports that it has corrected its excessive pass-throughs, or how it's lowered the pass-throughs, and how it will in the future continue to bring it down to 100%. Now, obviously, they don't want to just delete the whole pass-through all at once or bring it down to 100% all at once, because that's something that they would call rate shock. So if it's not bad enough to see a 6 or 7% increase in those categories, it would be even worse to see a 7 or 8 or 10% increase in those categories. So that's why the PRC lets them spread this out over the course of a couple, 3 years, so that rate shock does not occur. In some situations, the Postal Service is allowed to still maintain an over 100% discount, or pass-through rather, because the statute allows legitimizing reasons, such as to encourage positive mailer behavior, or for some other reason. They're listed in the statute, and every year, as in this year, as in other years, the Postal Service has to tell the Rate Commission the reasons from statute that allow them to not bring that pass-through down to 100% or lower than it is right now. Now, again, comparing 2018 and 2019, you can see how some of the changes last year compared to some of the changes this year. Some places got an increase last year, aren't getting an increase this year. There is the occasional stray decrease in price. You see the couple green numbers there that are sprinkled in. That's again because how the calculations work out, how rate relationships have to be maintained, and so forth. So again, this sort of supports the Postal Service's statements that they try to look at things over the course of a multi-year period. So if you wanted to take the time and trouble to go through and see how these add up over the period, and then factor in efforts to reduce the pass-throughs, and all that make a little bit more sense. Okay, let's see here. Next, we've got the over 4 ounce. We have flats, both under and over 4 ounces, and you can see here how those prices changed. In many cases, they didn't change that much. In other cases, they changed significantly. Again, we have to think about both cost coverage and think about the pass-throughs that are being reduced. So that's why some of those numbers, like the 5-digit in the non-automation and in both commercial and nonprofit, the 5-digit or the origin entry, I should say, 5-digit and other situations are taking significant hits because of how the discounts are being aligned with the true amount of money that is saved, the true amount of work that is saved by the Postal Service. Okay, comparing again how last year and this year happened, you can see how in the situations where there are discounts being fixed or there are cost coverage issues for the less finely sorted or origin entered mail, you've got a higher level of increase than you would for other types of mail. High density plus and saturation, carrier out, flavors of carrier out last year had relatively modest or under CPI increases. And this year, they didn't get any in most cases. So that, again, is how the Postal Service says, this is the type of mail we're encouraging you to produce and to enter. And the types of mail that cost us more to process rather, are the ones we're telling you through price, you probably should rethink and not produce as much. Of course, the obvious incentive here is derived by the mailer's ability to aggregate sufficient volume, sufficient density, so that you can make high density things. If you're mailing 1,000 pieces nationwide, your chances of getting any kind of density anyplace are pretty slim. So in that case, you're submitting mail that's going to be more expensive to process, going to go through more processing facilities, so it can be touched by more hands. So that's going to be a little more costly, and that's why some of those numbers are behaving as they are. Okay, comparing again the over 4-ounce flats from last year to this year. Where did the prices go up every year? Where do the prices not go up? Same idea. You've got the occasional green number there. There's one green figure for 5-digit per piece rate last year, but that wasn't there this year. Again, logical rate relationships, incentivizing mailer behavior, and reflecting cost coverage are the reasons why some of these prices move in the way that they do. Again, over a 2-year period. If you want to look at 2017 and look at 2020 next year and see how things move over a 4-year period, that may even be even more instructive. But again, it's difficult to take these in a 1-year cycle and have it be entirely logical. Now, other things are happening in the marketing mail change this year, the most important being that for the first time, the Postal Service is separating out the price for detached address labels from the price for detached marketing labels. DALs don't have paid advertising, and the price is going up by a half a penny from 4 cents to 4.5 cents. But the price for DMLs, which do have paid advertising, is jumping by 20% from 4 cents to 5 cents. The Postal Service established the framework for this 7 years ago, but never had different prices. This year, they decided to do that because, in their belief, they can get more money out of the DML because it reflects a higher value to the mailer. Obviously, you're selling, the mailer is selling ad space on it. Therefore, they're bringing in more revenue. So the Postal Service is essentially saying, well, if it's that valuable to you, then we want a piece of that action. And they're getting a half a cent more for it. So that's probably the biggest single change we're seeing right there for marketing mail. Overall, otherwise, as you can see, flats cost can remain a major driver of over CPI increases. This is true in all classes of mail. We saw it in first class, we saw it in standard, and we'll see it in other classes in the next few slides. And again, some of these are because of PRC directives to fix those pass-throughs. Every year, the Postal Regulatory Commission reviews the Postal Service's annual compliance filing, and it tells them every year, you've got too many things that are over 100%, bring them down, and they're still doing it. We talked about rate shock as a factor in moderating some of these adjustments, and that'll continue until they're all down to where they need to be. So this kind of gives you an idea of how little or how much was underneath the price change for marketing mail. Now, looking at periodicals, for those of you who are involved in this, periodicals as a class was as best it could do, 1.9%. A little more heavily on the outside county mail where most of the volume is, and the Postal Service got to that little bit higher number by some changes, by tweaking some figures within the periodicals matrix of prices for trays and sacks, for some bundles, again, in trying to encourage operational efficiency, and that is efficient mail preparation, trying to send messages to the periodicals producers to reduce the number of required handlings on the part of the Postal Service, and just trying to do the best they can within a very narrow range of options. Periodicals prices will never reach full cost coverage unless they were increased by twice what you see there, or maybe even more in some cases. Periodicals is virtually entirely flat size mail, and the cost challenges that are facing flats in general are really bad news for periodicals, because the cost coverage continues to fall back. Now it's somewhere around like 80%, I think. So it's just not a good picture for periodicals or periodicals rates. Looking at package services, what little is left of package services in the market dominant group, theirs was just under 1.9%. Alaska bypass was just in Alaska. That's at the average. Most of the volume, of course, is in bomb printed matter, media and library mail, and they're trying to get the cost coverage up on media and library, even though they probably will not get it this rate case or in the next one. Even at that, though, they still have to recognize the statutory requirement that these pieces pay a more modest rate because of what is claimed to be their educational, cultural, scientific, and informational value. So those are somewhat protected types of mail based upon congressional decisions made decades ago. But the work share discounts, at least, those have been straightened out, so nothing abnormal will be happening among those discounts. Special services, there are many of those. You can see that those were changed as a class average of just over 1.9%. And you can dig into each of those for whatever it might be of interest to you to see how the individual service that you prefer has moved. Tracking was decreased by half. They said it's still paying more than it needs to. So that was a good deal if you use that. Several address management services, because the Postal Service saw those as being of value to mailers, were given a little bit higher boost. And that was the total. In total, address management services went up by over 4%. And you've got changes for P.O. boxes, caller service, and so forth, as you can see in the chart there. Now, the price changes for competitive products, as we talked about earlier, those are set by the governors, and the governors alone can do that. If you recall, a couple of years ago, we had a bit of a problem with the promotions because there was no governor around to sign off on it. We do have governors this year, and they've approved all these prices. The price increase for the competitive products is relatively modest. The retail prices tend to go up a little bit more than the commercial prices because though these are not regulated by the PRC, they're regulated by other competitors. So if UPS is raising its rates by 1.5%, that puts a lot of downward pressure on the Postal Service's prices because obviously they don't want to become non-competitive. So this is the range of prices that was announced, and that will be effective unless there's a problem detected by the PRC. So what the PRC has to do now is deal with these filings. The Postal Service, by statute, has to give the public 45 days notice of a change for market dominant prices and a 30-day notice for competitive products. Actually, what they're doing, if you look at the time between October 9th and January 26th, it's about 112 days. So they consistently will beat the 45-day or 30-day requirement. This, of course, gives time for the PRC to do its work. It has ordered the publication of both filings in the Federal Register and has granted time for public comment through the end of October. There's also a comment period for on the competitive product side too. But the way the law reads, the Commission just has 2 weeks after the comment period ends to determine whether the planned adjustments are under the cap, whether they fit within that limitation. So that means, depending how you want to count, I think I counted right, by the 18th of November, we should have a decision back from the PRC about the market dominant filing. Now, what's happened in the past is the PRC looks this over, looks at the work papers supporting the Postal Service's filing, has questions, and sometimes they have some significant questions or some significant issues with the documents, and they say they're incomplete. We can't render a decision because we're missing information. We don't have enough documentation. It happened with Standard Mail a couple of years ago, and there's no guarantee it couldn't happen again here. And that, of course, would stop the clock and push out the decision date for the final decision. Barring any problem, though, hopefully we'll see something back from the Commission in mid-November. Same thing holds true for the competitive products. They really have to do just three things: make sure that the prices that were proposed, that were announced, I should say, represent full cost coverage, that the competitive products are not being cross-subsidized by the market dominant products, and that the competitive products as a whole are contributing what they call the appropriate share to institutional costs, the overhead of the Postal Service. Right now, the appropriate share is, I think, just between 5 and 10%, and competitive products as a group are contributing in the low 20%. So they're well beyond the minimum they have to contribute. So again, in this case here, though there's no deadline, we should see them come back with the PRC come back with a decision about the same time as they come back with the market dominant decision. So if that's the case, you'll have about 2 months then for all the changes to be made in software, rate tables, Postal Service forms, whatever. All that will be done in time for the January 26th implementation. Now, what, of course, I didn't cover today is the proposed rule for any related classification changes or preparation changes. That's because it's not out yet. There will be one at some point. I don't know to what degree the Postal Service proposes to change the DMM, but if it does, and it almost certainly will make some kind of change to the DMM, then that proposal has to come out relatively quickly, because that would bring with it a comment period of 14, 21, 30 days, whatever, which would then be followed by a time for the Postal Service to digest those comments and issue a final rule in time for it to be implemented in a sensible manner before January 26th. So that's going to happen yet. We haven't seen it yet. Maybe we'll see it later this week. I keep looking for it. I also didn't talk about the promotions. There are 6 promotions again this year. They're the same promotions as we saw last year, and they're essentially along the same sets of requirements. So you'll see the same 3 promotions that are available to everybody, to all, I shouldn't say all classes. Emerging and advanced technology, earned value, reply mail, and informed delivery are open to both first and marketing mail. Personalized color transformer is only for first class. Tactile, sensory, and interactive engagement and mobile shopping are only for marketing mail. Again, those are pretty much what you had last year, or I guess they're running right now, 2019. And generally the rules are the same, discounts are the same, and the promotion periods are similar to what we were this year. All of this, of course, is detailed in the newsletter in Monday's, what's today, Tuesday, yesterday's issue of the newsletter. So that's a little more information for you on that. Looking over the horizon, we have some things coming up, and this is something else which is going to be coming out soon. It's a proposed rule for seamless acceptance. And this would be something that pertains initially to all mailers who enter at a DMU or who have 90% full service mail that they bring to the post office. And the timeline you see there is what they were talking about a month ago. And this is what was going to be in their proposed rule if it was issued last month. Of course, because it wasn't issued last month, it's reasonable to expect that these dates will change, or they may simply be fixed dates that are X amount of time beyond the issuance of the final rule. This is not, of course, a rate issue per se, but this is going to be something which will require work by mailers and may result in mail preparers moving even more heavily into full service IMB mail, which would get them better rates, of course, and greater density, which has its own benefits. Also coming ahead here, we've got the end of the Postal Regulatory Commission's decennial rate review. This is very, very late. They started their review almost 3 years ago, issued a report almost 2 years ago, and had a proposed rule for how to fix the rate setting process, how to fix the cap process to generate enough revenue to pay the Postal Service's bills. So they had these ideas about how to break the cap for different purposes, but that rulemaking was not completed because of obvious strong opposition from the mailing community. The problem, of course, is that the current rate setting process was not designed to pay the $55.8 billion pre-funding requirement. That was tacked on after the rate setting process was built. So short of congressional action to alter that requirement, there's no way that the current process is going to pay that bill. And even if the PRC tried to put that in force, it's doubtful they would get away without any litigation. So, oops, wrong direction here. Here we go. Okay, I'm going backwards. There we go. All right. What else is going on? As I mentioned before, we had the litigation over prices for first-class mail for single piece. I don't know where that's going to go. It may well, the Department of Justice, who represents the PRC, may well ask for a full hearing, by the full appeals court, all 18 judges, rather than the 3-judge panel that rendered the past decision. I don't know what's going to happen, but it is a complication we need to keep an eye on going into the next one. And this, of course, as I said, is a situation where the PRC was found to have not used what they call reasoned decision-making in saying that the 55-cent stamp was appropriate. So this is in a way started out to be an annoying little sideshow, but now it's become a rather significant complication to what should otherwise be a rather plain vanilla run-of-the-mill rate change. Okay, what else is going to be coming ahead? Well, there are things beyond the rate case we still need to be aware of because it's still going to happen at some point in the future. We still have vacancies on the Board of Governors, and there are some folks who are sitting in chairs right now who are going to be, whose terms and grace years are going to expire soon, unless the White House puts up some names, unless Congress, the Senate, acts upon those and confirms them. We may well be back into a situation at some point where we have no governors. And that's just no way to run a railroad. So we got to make sure we keep an eye on that. As we have talked about in other webinars, we have state sales and use tax laws that are changing because of a Supreme Court decision. We have changes in state privacy laws, primarily led by California and led by the Europeans, who are going to impose some new and rather strict requirements on how you use address lists. That's something you've got to pay attention to as developments occur. Of course, next July, after the Postal Service, or the U.S. rather, decided not to pull out of the Universal Postal Union after some changes were made to how international prices are set. In July, the Postal Service will set its own rates for international mail, for incoming mail, and hopefully collect a little bit more for those little items coming in from China and other places. Now, we talked about cost. Well, of course, the biggest cost the Postal Service sees is labor, and we've got one labor agreement in arbitration and 2 more that are still under negotiation. So depending upon how those work out, you're going to see an impact on postal costs. And the worrisome thing is that while all that's happening, you've got the key source of revenue these days, parcel volume, continues to slip as shippers, as we said before, as shippers and other carriers insource the delivery of items that were once given to the Postal Service. So hoping for congressional action on reform, you can light a candle or 2 or 7, but I don't know if you're going to get anything out of it because Congress is too busy fighting with each other to really get anything substantial done on any issue, let alone postal stuff. So that's sort of where we stand on things that are, on some of the things coming over the horizon. So at this point, if there are any questions out there, I would be more than happy to take them. Let's see. I don't see any. Michelle is helping. She's the ever helpful person in the background, keeping the lights on. Do you see any questions, Michelle? Have you had any? I don't see any. If anybody has a question, you can type it in the little question box, or for that matter, just send me a text. I'll try to figure it out. Otherwise,
sorry, I was supposed to unmute there. I don't see any questions just yet. We did have a raised hand earlier, but I don't see a question. I didn't see a question from them yet, so.
Okay. Your handouts include today's webinar, a PDF of the slides we used, and subscribers got a copy of the newsletter containing, the summary of the rate change in words, some questions and answers that are typical surrounding a rate change, all the prices and the comparisons, the percentage changes that you saw on some of the slides. So that's out there for you to use. Again, there's our contact information if anybody wants to reach us to ask questions or to subscribe. That is available for you, and you can also use the link mailershubwebinars.com to register for future webinars. So without any further ado, seeing no questions, I want to thank everybody for calling in today. We'll redo this again next Tuesday. If anybody in your shop who wants to sit in for that who couldn't come in today. There is, let's see, I got one question here regarding market mail. Is there a reduction in the discount to drop ship from NDC to SCF? There were changes to the drop ship discounts. There was a problem that the Postal Service discovered in numbers it had used, I think 2 years ago, where they had miscalculated volume and in turn some of the amount of money they could offer discounts, and they've spent the past 2 years or so fixing that. So the discount will be adjusted accordingly, both this year, last year, and in the future. It may be sending the wrong price signal, but it's something the Postal Service has to do to correct its error in giving too large a discount like I said, about 3 years ago. So let's see, do we have any other questions here? I don't see any. Okay, so again, thank you very much for calling in today. We're going to do it again next week. If you have any questions, please let us know. There's our information. And until we talk again, thank you again for your support. Thank you again for your attention. And thank you to Michelle for helping out today. We will see you next time. Bye.